Hi everyone, welcome back to Winging It. My name's Rebecca. If you're new here, you're very welcome, and if you're a regular, then welcome back. We're in week 40 and it's the first week in October, and that means we've got a new colour prompt. And through this month, we are going to be exploring neutrals. Now I'm going to talk about those a little bit more in a moment. This is one of my favourite colour families, and I enjoyed this week's piece so much. I really hope you enjoy it too. Everything you're going to need is listed in the description below, so check that out, gather all your bits and pieces, and let's get stitching. This month we're going to be exploring neutral tones, and I've just got a selection here of colours that I've picked out. Now, neutral tones can be anything really that is muted and quite a gentle tone. They range from greys through to beiges, taupes, almost like minky colours, pale peaches, pale pinks, things like that. They can look quite washed out, and sometimes they can look like they don't have any colour at all. But I've got some threads here that are a really good example of this. So here I've got a thread which it's DMC Ecru, and you might just look at that and think it's a pale grey or just an off-white, and you could describe it like that. But when I put it next to a different off-white, suddenly you can see one has got almost blue tones to it, this one here, and this one is a much peachier, beigeier sort of colour. And again, if I bring this one up, you can see that this one on the left is more yellow than this one on the right. The one on the right is actually significantly darker. It's much clearer in person, but I think the camera's picking it up. It's significantly darker as an off-white and is a lot warmer than this one here. And if I put these two together, you can see one of them is actually very cold. This one here has got very cold undertones, and this one is much warmer. So again, if I bring this one up, you could look at that and say, well, that's just a brown. This is DMC 3860. And if I bring up one that is a similar sort of value, you can see this one is 3862. So they're a similar value, they're similar sort of intensities of colour. This one on the right has almost got purple undertones to it. This one is much more yellow, and this one is a colder brown. So on their own, they don't look like they are going to do very much, but actually they tend to change depending on what you pair them with and the light that you're looking at them in. So these are the sorts of colours that we're going to be using. My first idea was to do something like a washing line. The neutral colours made me think about linen and sort of towels and bed sheets and things like that, and I wondered whether it might be fun to do something similar to our bunting that we did back in July, but hang little items of clothing and pillowcase and things like that on a washing line. But I couldn't easily see where we get our woven stitches in, and I thought it might just end up looking like we'd stitched down a few odd bits of fabric, and I just wasn't confident about this one at all. Another thing I'd been thinking about when I was thinking about neutrals was cups of tea and coffee and hot chocolate, and I wondered whether it might be fun to make some cups of coffee, and we could do needle weaving inside the cup shapes and make them darker at the bottom and then fading up to a lighter, milkier colour and make it like lattes, or we could do a cappuccino or something like that. And I was really tempted by this idea. I thought we could also maybe use our couching from last month and put in some wisps of steam and add some lettering. It might be nice to do that. But my issue with this one was it didn't really give very much scope for a range of stitches, and it was going to be all needle weaving, and I thought it limited us a little bit. The thing that kept coming up when I was researching neutral colours was the idea of neutral colour schemes for weddings, and I kept seeing pictures of the most beautiful bouquets, wedding bouquets made out of neutral colours, and I thought actually there's quite a lot of scope here for us to use a number of our stitches, so we could add in little details with some of the stitches from earlier months, but we could make some leaves out of our woven picot stitches that sit up from the surface, and these naturally lend themselves to woven wheels, and we could maybe get some spider's web wheels in there as well. And I thought this gave us most scope to explore a range of neutral colours and use several different stitches as well. So this is the idea I decided I was going to go with. I'm going to be working on this lovely sort of camel coloured piece of felt, and I thought we'd keep it fairly straightforward this week. So I've just got a bunch of 6-strand embroidery threads in a range of neutral colours. They're sort of beiges and browns. I've got this sort of peachy colour in there as well, just to add a little bit of something different. This one's more peachy as well. And I've dug out a bunch of my neutral beads. So I'm just going to set up my square and then we'll come back and start stitching. So I've set up my square based around these 3 largest circles, and I've sort of offset them so they don't form too regular a triangle, and then I've just built up some smaller circles around that will be effectively the flowers, and I've also added in some leaf shapes, and I thought they would form a nice sort of frame to our flowers. And we can add in some tendrils and wispy bits and things like that once we've stitched everything in and got a sense of what it's looking like. But I'm fairly happy with that arrangement as a starting point, and I thought we would start with our leaves because they're going to need to be sort of underneath the flower heads. So I'm going to do woven picots for these, and I need my pin for that, so I'm just going to start with this one here. And I'm going to put my pin in the tip of the leaf and bring it out at the bottom. I'll just go slightly onto that flower. Now, if you have never heard of a woven picot and don't know what I'm talking about, I do demonstrate it in this month's stitch guide, and I'll put a link at the top of the screen to that video so that you can learn all the stitches that we're using. So we start off by looping around our pin. We start at the bottom, loop around our pin like that, and then I'm going to come up in the middle like that, as close to the pin as I can get, and loop around the top again. And then I'm going to use the eye end of my needle to weave around those 3 strands that I've created. So I'm going under the first one, over the middle and under the third, and pulling through, and I want to sort of pull up so that everything stays nice and tight. And I went under last time, so I'm going to go over, under, over. So when I'm going right to left, it's under, over, under, and left to right, it's over, under, over. So when I've reached the bottom, I can take my needle through to the back and take my pin out, and there's my first leaf. I think I could probably have packed that first one a little bit tighter, but it's absolutely fine. So up in the middle again and go around the pin, and then we're going to weave. So there's our little picot, got 2 there. woven stitches, so that one I could have done with packing a little bit more tightly. You can see some spaces, but I don't mind it actually. It shows that it's woven, and you can just sort of rearrange them a little bit. That one's a lot tighter and better. So I'm going to put in my leaves and then we'll come back and look at the next stage. I have added in my little woven picot leaves, and you can see I've used two shades. So I've got this mushroomy, almost purpley shade here, and I've used a sort of more coffee colour and scattered them around. So that's my picots. So I'm going to put in my largest flowers last, and I thought it would be good to put in some of the smaller ones. And I thought, even though they're not woven stitches, they are quite sweet. I'm going to put in some little lazy daisies. We looked at these in our standalone stitches during August. So it's just detached chain stitches all going from the centre, and I'm just going to work those around the circle. I'll just go back to the centre each time and change the angle of the stitch. So I've got the two strands of this peachier colour here. Got a little daisy there, and I do find it easier to just cut off rather than leave a big trailing thread across the back. So I'll just cut off there and start again. So this one's going to be just about balancing your colours around your piece and making sure that it's not too regular, but that there's a good scattering of each colour around the arrangement of flowers. I thought it'd be nice to put a couple of spider's web wheels in. I'm going to start by putting in my spokes, and this is the one where it doesn't really matter how many spokes you have. You can have an odd number or an even number, it really doesn't matter. So I'm just going to pop those in. We'll just try and space them fairly evenly around this circle, and we'll just see how many we get. Okay, so I've put some spokes in, and now I'm going to come up close to the centre, and I'm going to go forward, back one and forward two, back one and forward two. And again, this is detailed in much more depth in our stitch guide video, so I think this was the first one that we did in that video, so you'll be able to find it pretty easily. And we just keep going round and round and round, going back one, forward two, and gradually we'll form some spokes that are raised above the surface. Okay, so there's my first spider's wheel. I'm going to put a few more of those in, and then we'll come back and look at these big flowers. Okay, so I've put in my spider's web wheels. So you can see I've got a couple of different shades in there. So I thought we could work on our bigger flowers now, and I'm going to do woven wheels, and you might be able to see that I've put in some spokes. I've done 7 spokes per wheel here. So we're going to put in the spokes the same way that we put in these ones, just with some straight stitches, and I'm using all 6 strands for this one. I'm not entirely concerned that these are completely even, because it is just going to hopefully make the flower, I don't want them too uneven, but if they're slightly off, I don't mind, because they're going to make our flower look a little bit more natural, and I'm hoping it will look a lot like a rose. I'm making some of my spokes just overlap those leaves and flowers on the outside. And when we've put our bigger flowers in, we'll be able to see where the gaps are, and I thought we could fill those in, maybe with some more daisy stitches, but also perhaps some beads as well. So there are my spokes, and if you remember from our stitch tutorial, this is the one where you must have an odd number of spokes, otherwise the stitch won't work. So I've got my spokes in, I've brought my needle back up at the middle, and I'm just going to weave over under all the way around. And because there's an odd number of spokes, every time I do a circuit, I change from over to under. There's our first one. I'm going to put in the other 2, and then we'll look at how we're going to add some more wispy bits and fill in any gaps. So I've put in those 3 larger woven wheels, and I've used slightly different shades of off-white just to add a bit of variety, and I did find that there was a bit more space than I was expecting, and I thought it might be nice to put in some smaller woven wheels just in those gaps. I'm doing that partly because they look lovely, but also I wanted to show you the different look that you get if you use fewer spokes. So when you're working with a fairly large circle, if you only use 5 spokes, the stitch tends to rise up and become quite unmanageable, and the threads work their way underneath each other. And so if you're working on a circle this sort of size, you probably need 7 or 9 spokes. But on a smaller circle, you can get away with 5. So I'm going to put 5 in here, and I'm just going to weave the stitch in exactly the same way, and you'll be able to see that the effect of the weaving when it's finished is much more rounded, almost like a cup, and the sides overlap each other a little bit more. So if I just show you that, you can see that they're much more petal-like and more rounded, and it's just a lovely look that almost looks like a different stitch to the larger ones. So I'm going to put a couple more of those in. So I've put some of those in. There's still quite a lot of space, and I thought it might be nice to put in some beads. I don't know what these sorts of beads are called. They're almost like flat discs, and they're a sort of pearly cream colour, and I thought they might be quite nice because they'll sit up a little bit and add a little bit more texture. So I'm just going to dot a few of those around. I'm using a straw needle here and just a single strand of thread. I'm just trying to scatter them around so that they're evenly spaced. And then I've got these. I just love these. They're some of my favourite beads in my stash. They're sort of almost colours. They're quite neutral and very muted tones, but there's sort of an almost purple and an almost blue and an almost pink in there. And they just will add a little bit of dark detail here and there, so I don't want it all to be mid-tone. Just because it's neutrals, it doesn't mean it all has to be sort of mid-tone and washed out. So I want some lights and darks in there. So I'm going to scatter a few of those around, and I'm looking at colour distribution again. So I've also got these quite yellowy beige beads. They're almost like tiger's eye. They're quite glossy, pearlescent and totally spherical, and I just want to see how they look first. I think we'll get away with using those. So I'm going to add a few more of those in, and we're just going to build up with beads and little details just to fill in those gaps, add texture and add a little bit of sparkle. You know me and beads, nothing's quite finished unless it's got some beads on it. So I'm going to scatter those around, and then I might add in some more paler beads just around the outside, just so that it's a little bit more full in the panel. I'll find some little creamy seed beads to just scatter, moving out from that quite dense centre of the arrangement. And I want to add in some more wispy foliage. So I've just got 2 strands of a dark brown here, and I'm just going to use other stitches from my repertoire that we've learnt through this year. So I'm just putting in some feather stitch branches here to sort of take my arrangement out into the corners of the panel and just add a little bit of detail at the edges. This is all about balance, this one. So we're balancing light shades and dark shades and mid-tones. We're also balancing the space. So we're trying to get some areas that are quite densely packed and other areas that are a little bit thinner. And we're also balancing tone. So I've got some pinks in there, browns, and I'm trying to make sure that no one area of the design is too heavy in any one thing. So it's all about just stitching a little bit and then looking at it and reflecting and judging what's needed to develop the design and make it look balanced. So I'm just going to add in a few lines of feather stitch just around the outside, and when I get close to my arrangement, I'm sort of tucking the last stitch underneath the flowers at the edge so that they look like they're coming from behind. Another stitch that we've used before, I'm using a sort of darker mid-tone here, and I'm going to put in some detached chain stitches, but we're going to put quite long stalks on them so they almost look like little seed heads poking out as part of the framework of this bouquet. So I'm just going to add in a few of those. So we go as if we're making a chain stitch, but rather than then creating another loop, we just put a long stalk on it. And we covered both of these stitches back in March when we looked at loop stitches, and I will put a link to that at the top of the screen so that you can learn those stitches if you haven't done them before. So again, I'm just looking for where it feels like it needs a little bit of something and popping those in. Now, as a finishing touch, I thought it was now looking too beady and there were sections where I needed a little bit more thread. So I thought I'd play around with another of our previous stitches, and that is a French knot. And what I'm going to do is not keep tension on the thread. So if you make a French knot but just don't pull it too tight, if you let that working thread go, when you take your needle through, so you can see there that I've wrapped quite loosely and I'm not holding onto the thread. When you pull your needle through, you should get a little bit of a loop. If I'm honest, I'm not very good at doing this because I like everything to be just so. I'm not very good at being free and easy with my stitching. It's something that I need to develop. But they create lovely sort of loopy textural stitches, and sometimes you do want a really nice tight French knot, but other times you want a little bit more texture, and it's just another way of using the French knot to add some interest to your work. So I'm just going to add in some of those scattered around. And here's our finished piece. So you can see we've got our woven wheels, we've got our spider's web wheels, we've got our woven picots, and all sorts of different bits and pieces all around. And I just absolutely love this piece. It's my kind of colours. It's exactly the sort of thing I love to stitch. So I hope you've enjoyed that too. I'm really looking forward to seeing what you create with the prompt neutrals. Do share your creations at #FSHWingingIt, and so that we can see all our neutrals pieces together, you could also add #FSHWingingIt40. That's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you've enjoyed this piece and you want to do something else that's floral, I'll leave a link here, and I'll put a link up here to a video that's best for you. Please give us a like so that more people can see this video, and if you want to subscribe, click on our logo down here and that will make it really easy. Have a great week, happy crafting, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!